Where is the chorus of academics standing up for free speech and against the persecution of Professor Jordan Peterson? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa, and I'm speaking to you today from my office, so you may hear some sound of voices out in the hall. As many of you probably know, psychology professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto has been much in the news lately and all over YouTube for objecting to the repressive reign of political correctness on university campuses.
It's as a consequence of free speech and the ability to speak that people can put their finger on problems, articulate what those problems are, solve them, and come to a consensus. And we risk losing that.
His focus has been the relatively new Canadian bill to include gender identity and gender expression as protected categories in human rights legislation and in the criminal code, whereby the failure to use pronouns consistent with individuals' preferences, whether male or female or neither male nor female or both, could be interpreted as a human rights violation. Professor Peterson has argued that this legislation and its likely application go one step further than other anti-discrimination legislation, not only in restricting what one can say, but in actually mandating what one must say. In the first video of his that started all the fuss, and in subsequent interviews, Professor Peterson has pointed out the various contradictions and incoherencies in the proposed amendments and the definitions associated with them. The vagueness and the downright confusion of a lot of the language. The insistence on accommodating people's needs, for example, as if needs could be easily determined and never in conflict. And the logical incoherence of a theory of gender that sees a trans identity as innate and unalterable, but other gender identities as purely a cultural construct. And he objects to elevating into fact or law something that isn't self-evidently either. And he talks about the fear that is now so much a part of these discussions, whereby professors who once felt it their right and duty to pursue all manner of truth with their students now self-censor in order to avoid complaints or the wrath of the administration. He has expressed his concern that soon, if not already, basic conversations about whether gender identity is really separate from biological sex, or even whether there is such a thing as biological sex, will be absolutely forbidden. His videos were not only a way of talking through his questions and thoughts, but also a kind of testing of the waters to determine if his fears were irrational. And in the event, it turned out that Peterson's analysis of where we are with human rights legislation in Canada was all too prescient.
Is that what you said? I said I was wondering if I could get your opinion.
No, we're good. Thank you.
Fuck you, that's my opinion.
We're good.
Memo is racist. Privilege.
Smile at me, bitch. What you want?
They did grab me and pull me in and try to punch me.
Officer, I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything that happened.
There's no reason to be
I didn't see anything.
Free speech is the alternative to violence. And there's lots of people who like violence and who are waiting for the opportunity to use it. And I'm hoping that we can talk our way out of it.
The response to the University of Toronto downtown campus was hysterical and vitriolic. denunciations of Peterson as a transphobe, claims that trans people had been made to feel unsafe, claims that Peterson's speaking about the matter of pronouns was an existential threat to the transgendered. This is the typical gambit of what a friend of mine calls the psychotic left. Their claim that whatever the topic, it is always a matter of life and death, and that merely taking a non-compliant position contributes to horrific suffering and even to the slaughter of innocents. And most chilling and indicative, the University of Toronto administration has sent Peterson 2 letters, the second of which has told him in no uncertain terms that if he fails to fall in line, his university will not stand behind him. Here's part of the letter. Quote, "The law of Ontario, specifically the Ontario Human Rights Code, protects against discrimination based on gender expression and gender identity. Depending on the context, if personal pronouns are being used, the refusal by a teacher or colleague to use the personal pronoun that is an expression of the person's gender identity can constitute discrimination. Your statements that you will refuse to refer to transgendered persons using gender-neutral pronouns if they ask you to do so are contrary to the rights of those persons to equal treatment without discrimination. You should also be aware that many members of the university community are concerned and distressed about the declarations of your discriminatory intentions. The university has received communications from individuals, student groups, and employee groups that find your comments to be unacceptable, emotionally disturbing, and painful." End quote. With this letter, the university administration confirmed everything Professor Peterson had said in his first video. Not only must everybody accede to pronoun demands, but one must refrain from even mentioning the whole matter. Yes, even to discuss the subject in an unacceptable way may be some kind of human rights violation. I don't really have anything original to say here because Professor Peterson has himself said it all very well, but I wanted to speak in his support for what that's worth and to say that his case confirms fears I've had for a very long time about how we as a society have given over our freedom to revolutionary social justice agents. This whole debate is and is not about pronouns, in my opinion. Like most people, like Jordan Peterson himself, I'm not interested in hurting anyone's feelings or harming their dignity. But far worse than that is making laws to punish people who think incorrectly on a subject that, as Peterson himself argues, is far from settled. Forcing people to say what they deeply believe to be untrue, for example, that there are 32 genders, that there is no biological sex, forcing people to employ new pronouns on pain of social mobbing, the ruination of reputation, job loss, or investigation by a human rights tribunal. Is that really how we want to deal with controversial issues as a society? That's the question. And the answer is, as Jordan Peterson's case has shown, the answer is that it's too late to have that conversation. We already are that society. The laws are already in place. In fact, the Supreme Court of Canada already ruled nearly 4 years ago that the prohibition on hateful or discriminatory speech is more important than any other value in our society. And almost nobody protested that or even noticed. February 27th, 2013 was the date on which the Supreme Court rendered its judgment, upholding 2 of the 4 findings of hate speech made by the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission against Bill Whatcott, an anti-gay member of the Christian Truth Activists. Whatcott was convicted of, quote, promoting hatred against individuals based on their sexual orientation, end quote, because he had put flyers on car windshields in 2002 and 2003 warning against what he perceived to be a homosexual agenda in Saskatchewan's primary schools to encourage children to become gay, essentially. He also pointed out that certain personal ads in gay publications appeared to be clearly seeking boys for sex. In his flyers, he used harsh language, words like sodomy and filth, which the Supreme Court affirmed to be in contravention of the Human Rights Code. Now, this was a landmark ruling, breathtaking in its lack of proportion, clarity, or reasonableness. The Supreme Court justices defined hate speech incredibly broadly, not by its content or by its intent, but by its likely, quote, effect in exposing a specific group or individual to hatred. In defining it thus, the Supreme Court entered a bizarre realm of supposition and unsupported allegation, given that an effect is impossible to predict in advance or even to prove often after the fact. But the justices didn't care. They tell us in their judgment that a conviction for hate speech does not require any, quote, proof of harm, merely a hypothetical likelihood. And as you know, SJWs find likelihood of harm nearly everywhere. As if to bolster what they knew to be an extremely weak argument, the Supreme Court justices detailed the potential consequences of hate speech in dramatic terms. This is what they said, quote, hate speech lays the groundwork for later broad attacks on vulnerable groups that can range from discrimination to ostracism, segregation, deportation, violence, and in the most extreme cases to genocide, end quote. All this from a few hundred crude flyers put on car windshields? I really doubt it. This is wild hypothesizing, pretending to show causation. Yes, hate speech may lay the groundwork for these serious harms, especially when it is promulgated by powerful leaders and institutions. But hate speech does not inevitably or even generally cause them. Far more frequently, in the case of a single individual such as Bill Whatcott, an utterance simply ends with itself. It is staggering to contemplate that the Supreme Court of Canada, supposedly encompassing some of the most serious and experienced legal minds in our country, considers that the mere possibility, no matter how slim, that general harms may follow a statement is an adequate ground for prohibiting that statement, especially when freedom of expression is the fundamental pillar of a free society. It is the fundamental pillar, and we've blown it all to smithereens. The justices never seriously recognize the danger of mandating what people can and can't say. They simply affirm the rightness of legislation to, quote, reduce or eliminate discrimination. The very idea that one can, quote, eliminate discrimination by harshly punishing individuals for expressing their honestly held opinions and fears is an extremely questionable assumption that the Supreme Court doesn't even bother to try to defend. This judgment isn't about defending arguments or interpreting legal precedents. It is about overturning the values that have traditionally been the basis of Canadian society and replacing them with new values made up by social justice ideologues. The judgment states, for example, that freedom of expression can and should be balanced against, quote, respect for group identity. Now, when did respect for group identity become a right of any sort, let alone a right that competes with and even overrides the right to freedom of expression? And how can respect as opposed to measurable equal treatment, how can respect possibly be legislated? But it gets even worse as one reads the judgment. At one point, the Supreme Court justices assert that, quote, the benefits of the suppression of hate speech and its harmful effects outweigh the detrimental effect of restricting expression, which by its nature does little to promote the values underlying freedom of expression, end quote. In other words, Watcott's expression did not promote free expression and is therefore better suppressed. This grammatically garbled contention that free speech matters only when it is speech of a certain type, the type that promotes, quote, the values underlying it, well, it's totally specious. Freedom of expression is itself a value. If expression is made conditional on, promoting a particular set of values, then it is clearly not in any sense free or valued in itself. One can only conclude that the authors of the judgment are either not clear in their own minds what freedom of expression means, or they seek to confuse readers as to its nature. But most egregiously of all, the Supreme Court judgment states emphatically that truth is no defense against a charge of hate speech. Here it is. Truthful statements can be presented in a manner that would meet the definition of hate speech, we're told in their Orwellian formulation. Quote, and not all truthful statements must be free from restriction, end quote. When even truth must be weighed against the potential of words to bring an individual or group into social disrepute, the mind boggles at the implications, the possibility for judicial abuse, and the chill on open discussion that will result. That was nearly 4 years ago, and as I said, nobody protested or even really noticed. So we are already at the point where one can be found guilty of contravening human rights law for speaking the truth, depending on who complains. With a system already fully in place for enforcing orthodoxy, the vast uprising against these laws necessary to make a change seems unlikely to happen because it's way too dangerous. Indeed, Jordan Peterson's case shows that the contest is essentially over and the enforcers have won. All it would take to push back against such thought control at the University of Toronto would be for a significant minority of other professors to come forward to say something like, if Jordan Peterson is going to be disciplined, then you'd better discipline me too, because this is ridiculous. I support Jordan Peterson's right not to be forced to call somebody G. That's how it would happen in a movie. But this isn't a movie. And the silence of the professors is deafening. To my knowledge, only Gad Saad has come out in strong support of Professor Peterson. The other professors are either on the side of the radicals or too scared to say boo, and with good reason. So for what it's worth, let me say here that if Jordan Peterson is going to be hauled before a human rights tribunal, I want to go too. I'm already being taken before one on a different matter, so maybe they can lump in a charge of misgendering too. And trust me, you guardians of our human rights, whatever fine you give to Jordan Peterson, we'll pay it for him. We ordinary people who don't like your way of, quote, eliminating discrimination by persecuting decent people for standing on principle. Professor Peterson talks in the first video about people being driven to the brink of madness by our politically correct culture. These are people he's actually seen in his clinical practice, people whose work environment is forcing them to take up ideological positions that they don't even believe in. And he's talking about teachers feeling that they really can't teach anymore because they have to constantly self-censor. And as all the reaction to his videos attests, what he was articulating was not just a fear and not just a good hunch about the future, but a very clear diagnosis of the present reality. We will all now have to knuckle under or stand up and be punished. Either way, it's becoming increasingly difficult or impossible to avoid the madness of our culture.